Thank you so much. That was really nice. And I'm so thrilled to be here to present on research related to the Unnamed Figures project. And it's really a special pleasure for me because as Catherine mentioned, the museum has played a huge role in the success of this project as a major lender of no fewer than 10 highly significant works for the show, as well as providing ongoing support of my research over a number of years. I'm so grateful to so many staff members here at MCHS, both past and present, for supporting the project in various ways. And also thank you, Marylanders, for welcoming me as a New Yorker by way of New England into your midst and letting me share in researching some of the amazing stories. I'm going to talk a bit this evening since we're here and there's so much to be discovered about this particular case study. I'm going to share some research relating to the Perry Hall suite of pictures that really formed the inspiration for the project when I started working on some of this research in 2017 as part of a graduate seminar at the University of Delaware in conjunction with Winter Tour. I'd also like to share some insights into the curatorial process for the exhibition and look in particular at a series of portraits. So here, just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of what we're going to talk about, these are some images of Perry Hall and descendants of a family of enslaved laborers at Perry Hall who became prominent members of the free Black community in Baltimore in the 19th century. And here are some examples of some other works that I will speak about, in particular looking at portraiture, which, as Catherine mentioned, developed in the 18th century in the British American colonies with a particularly complicated and insidious pictorial convention in which Black figures played subservient roles, as we're seeing in this example from Maryland at the top right corner, or your left, sorry, top left corner, in which these Black figures played subservient roles to primary white sitters. But I'm also going to spend some time tracing Black representation into the 19th century when African Americans begin to emerge from the margins in American art to occupy the center of the frame. So we're seeing a few different examples of that here in the bottom row. In our efforts to try to do justice to these complicated works and the frequently marginalized Black figures referenced within them, together with my co-curators, Dr. R.L. Watson and Dr. Sade Ayarinde, we pursued multiple approaches to interpretation for the show, not only looking through traditional art historical lenses, but also really grappling with a range of philosophical and ethical considerations, as well as political considerations, which I'll speak more about in this evening's talk. But to start with some background for those of you, I don't know if there are some in the audience who will have seen the show. It was not only on view in New York City at the American Folk Art Museum, but also at historic Deerfield last summer. So it's really been closed only for a few months at this stage. But if you didn't have a chance to see the show, most broadly speaking, our concept was to look at the history of African American representation with a special focus on the understudied area of the 18th century North and the early 19th century North, including Maryland as a border state, because as Catherine mentioned, there is just so much richness to be discovered, and we really didn't want to miss that opportunity to talk about some of these wonderful Maryland examples. Black figures and faces seldom appear in American art of this time period, and when represented, they are typically placed in secondary positions, subjected to marginalization, and portrayed as lacking individuality, as lacking interiority. Often they go unnamed altogether and are implicitly included from the story of the picture. So although initiated by the work's makers and they're originally intended consumers, almost all of whom were white, this kind of compositional sidelining has been reinforced in more recent years by histories of interpretation, with museums and art historians reinscribing through narrative repetition, sometimes unconsciously and sometimes not with bad intentions, but nonetheless reinscribing through narrative repetition white representations as the dominant point of interest in talking about pictures like this. So here we see an example of a figure incorporated into a portrait of an elite white sitter. Enslaved and free black servants are continually described only as accessories to power. In landscapes, small black staffage figures are often dismissed as incidental and not pursued with the same level of seriousness in terms of questioning who these individuals could have been and what their experiences could have been like. There are, of course, also countless unseen black men, women, and children who inhabited these same spaces referenced by pictures like this, but were never depicted at all. So the central question that we wanted to pursue in the exhibition was really a speculative one. What if we actively choose to refocus our attention and to center interpretation on questions about black presence and absence, even though the answers may elude us? So in reorienting our approach to such depictions and demanding something new from these old pictures, can we locate symbolic value in early American black figures for the present moment as cues to the historical presence of black individuals and their overlooked experiences in these contexts? So it was with these questions in mind that we gathered together over 120 objects for the show, most of them never before shown together, never assembled. And it was a wide range of media, including portraiture, needlework, works on paper, sculpture, photography, and other vernacular forms in keeping with the focus of the American Folk Art Museum. But I think through that focus on vernacular forms, really opening up opportunities to spend time looking at things that have often been dismissed in the space of the Encyclopedic Fine Art Museum. Imagery ranged broadly according to the complex scope of historical depictions of black people in America. And we, in our interpretation, wanted to make sure that we were directly acknowledging histories of enslavement, racism, and oppression, while also balancing with opportunities for remembrance and acknowledging those uplifting stories of black presence with powerful, sensitive portrayals that are available and that we will speak about in several cases. So the selection of works gave focus to early New England and the Mid-Atlantic due to historical misperceptions of the 19th century South as the singular site, in many cases, of early African-American history. In some regions, this has really become a willful mythology, New England in particular, that denies histories of slavery in the North and dismisses the importance of black people's contributions to life in the North. So as some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar, at the turn of the 19th century, to begin with a little Maryland case study, the prominent white Guff family commissioned several views of their Baltimore County plantation known as Perry Hall. And their goal with these paintings was undoubtedly to underscore their identity, their taste, their wealth, and their power. Unsurprisingly, given the painting's importance as representations of Guff family identity and heritage, we know the name of just about every white person represented within these images. But unnamed are the black figures both present and absent from these scenes. The diminutive black nursemaid who accompanies the Guff children in this picture in particular. And it was this figure that really captivated my interest when I began working on research on this iteration of the Perry Hall landscape, which is part of the collections of Winterthur Museum. As you can see, it's installed in a period room. We were not, for that reason, able to borrow it for the show, but we were able to borrow a wonderful suite of Perry Hall paintings from MCHC. So my work on this picture originally began in the fall of 2017 while I was working with Jennifer Van Horn and Catherine Dan Rober, two professors in the University of Delaware program. And quickly I realized I needed to make a beeline down here to not only see these works of art that are related, but also, and here are the three that were included in the exhibition, which are all housed here, but also to examine the deep well of archival material that's here in the library. This particular picture here, you'll see, is quite similar to the Winter Tour example, with a notable exception. There is an absence of the Black nursemaid who appears in the Winter Tour iteration. You're seeing here in a close-up. And I found that really interesting as a suggestion that although she seems to have an intimate relationship with the Guff family, she was nonetheless considered peripheral to the scene in such a way that she was excluded in this version. But nonetheless, traces of evidence allowed me to pursue a speculative narrative of this girl's life and legacy. And I poured through a number of different archival resources here, including this Guff family account book. There's also an estate, actually I think this is from the estate inventory, forgive me, of Harry Dorsey Guff, which included a list of people that were enslaved at the Perry Hall plantation, alongside numbers which are not actually the ages of the individuals listed, but the number of years that each individual had left to serve before they would be manumitted as part of the Guff family's intentions. Oh, forgive me. It was through this work that I was able to identify, very much with the help of then fellow at MCHC, Elizabeth Mallon, and also Greg Weidman, former staff member here. I was able to identify I think, quite likely candidate for the identity of this girl in the Perry Hall picture. And we believe that this, because of the dates of the picture and oral histories about the life of this particular Black family, as well as a number of other pieces of evidence, that this could very well be intended as a reference to a woman named Sib Hall, who I think would not have been much older than the Guff children herself when she was chosen as a playmate and a nursemaid to this group of white children. She was born in 1788. And she may have labored in this capacity from the time that she herself was a young girl. We know that she lived on the plantation with her daughters, Esther and Beck, who are listed here underneath her name. And we also know that although her daughter Esther and her daughter Beck were emancipated as children, it seems that Esther Hall continued to serve the Guff family in adulthood in exchange for pay. So she stayed on with the Guff family. Hall family tradition actually suggests that she served as a companion to Sophia Guff Carroll, who's also depicted in the Perry Hall landscape paintings, and that she, Esther, may even have been the biological daughter of Harry Dorsey Guff. So with this rich wealth of names that surface when you begin to follow these threads and conduct this research, there was such an opportunity to, I think, orient visitors to the possibilities of this kind of research that we chose this story to serve as a central introductory case study for the exhibition. And we were so thrilled to be able to include all three of these pictures of, from MCHC of the Perry Hall landscapes, alongside these powerful historical photographs of descendants of Sib Hall. We're seeing here her granddaughter, so Esther Hall's daughter, Sidney Hall Davidge. This photograph is here in the library collection and was on view alongside with photographs of Sidney Hall Davidge's grandson. I think that's correct, sorry. Yes, grandson, Harry Scythe Cummings, who became a pioneering African-American attorney, the first Black man to graduate with a law degree from the University of Maryland. And he's pictured here with his sister, Ida R. Cummings, who would become Baltimore's first Black kindergarten teacher. The extraordinary pride and charisma depicted in these figures made such a powerful counterpoint to the depiction of enslaved laborers at Perry Hall. And I think at the same time, we see how these even small snippets of evidence in descendants' journals, alongside these photographs and other recorded memories, really help to catalog a multi-generational inheritance of Black persistence and achievement, and to exponentially expand the seemingly quite limited potential for narrating Black heritage through these landscapes. And here is an installation shot that shows one of the Perry Hall paintings, which we were also able to display alongside a fascinating portrait of a white girl from the Guff family, Prudence Guff Carroll, painted by no less than Joshua Johnson. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this name as the first, often celebrated as the United States' first professional Black portraitist. This exceptional portrait is in the collection of Hampton, and we used the work as an opportunity to point out to visitors in the introductory section that even though the picture was made by an artist of color, there were no similar portraits of any of Carroll's Black contemporaries who may even have been biologically related to her in the case of Esther Hall, if in fact she was related to Harry Dorsey Guff. But we have an opportunity with a picture like this to raise some of the questions that we hoped visitors would engage with throughout the show. Although painted portraiture may have been understood by Black adults at this time as the province of wealthy white people, what might a child have thought? What might a child have understood about the meaning of portraiture? And did Prudence Guff Carroll wonder why she was portrayed on canvas while Black members of her household, and indeed possibly her family, were not? And how did Joshua Johnson feel? Did he feel constrained by his constant focus on white faces? Did enslaved residents looking at the painted images that adorned the walls of their enslaver's mansion ask themselves what it would be like to represent, to see their own faces represented there or reflected there? So these are some of the kinds of questions that we introduced in the introduction to the show and wanted visitors to engage with, recognizing that we were really asking a lot of people. We're asking people to do more work and to do more active work than they might be used to. But that was very much an ambitious goal that we wanted to set for ourselves, and we were very excited and energized to see the level of attention with which people were willing to engage these works and actually sought us out for additional information, even beyond what we provided. So to speak more about portraiture, this is another major component of the exhibition that required us as curators to address a set of thorny, ethical, art historical, and historical questions, because most of the earliest representations of Black figures in American art consist of images like this one, in which an enslaved Black child is presented to as kind of an adjunct, as an accessory, as a prop to a central white sitter. And we can see here how the artist has set this up compositionally by placing the Black child lower on the picture plane, by directing his gaze to center on the white figure, and also how the Black child is set up as a kind of a helpmeet. He's holding the drum to the white sitter's drumsticks. So his agency has been taken away from him in the way that this composition has set up. In the book for Unnamed Figures, which is still available, but there aren't very many copies left, so you might want to get on that if you're interested in having a look. There's a wonderful article co-authored by Jennifer Van Horn and Virginia Anderson, who's the curator of American art at the BMA, which poses some of the key questions that we sought to tackle in interpreting works like this. So this is a portrait in the conventional sense of this white boy who has a name, but how should we think about the image of the kneeling Black child? Much past interpretation has stated, I think correctly, that the use of this insidious art historical convention, which is often referred to as the trope of the Black page, is something that debases and marginalizes Black people by depicting them only in relationship to the white figures in the picture. And this is a trope that began in Europe and was especially present in Anglo-Dutch portraiture in the 17th century, making its way to the British American colonies, especially Maryland and Virginia in the early 18th century. But is this interpretive explanation what we should be continuing to emphasize when we look at works like this? Questions that assume Black agency, often excluding the possibility of telling other stories. You know, we have such short exhibition labels, and I feel like they're getting shorter with every revision of our best practices. But what is it leaving out when we decide that we're only going to describe this with humanity, I think in many cases, but nonetheless, we're only going to talk about the historical exclusionary intention of this picture? Can we also think more actively about Black agency and consider the Black figure in terms beyond what he is doing for this white figure? So we wanted to think differently about emphasis and encourage visitors to look more deeply at Black figures in ways that acknowledge the humanity of the individuals referenced by, if not always directly portrayed by pictures like this. So it's especially important, I think, to recognize the distinctions between this art historical trope in Europe, where Black presence in portraiture relied more on stock figures, versus the British American colonies, where the trope took on some very different conventions. It's much more common here to see a Black child positioned with a white child rather than with a white adult, and to see a Black child whose facial features are quite specific and quite particularized, sometimes even more so than the white figures that we see. And just to share an example that I talked about frequently when I was giving tours, this is by the same artist. And to me, the white faces in these two pictures are strikingly similar, kind of stylized, where you almost lose a sense of these two white figures as individuals. And yet the Black figures actually do appear to be representative of an individual. So how we talk about a work's title can also provide a powerful opportunity for reconsideration. And this is an example that gets discussed again in the article that I mentioned by Jennifer and Virginia. Virginia and her colleagues have spent quite a bit of time thinking about the title for this work, and they've chosen to reframe our understanding of the two figures in this picture by providing it with a thoughtfully reconsidered title. So this picture has previously been referred to as Charles Calvert and His Slave, or simply Charles Calvert. And it is now titled, as you see here, Charles Calvert and a Once Known Enslaved Attendant, which I think is a phrase that captures the humanity of the person depicted or referenced, while also retaining the realities of historical uncertainty and erasure of the boy's identity. So it's both a recuperative gesture that also acknowledges the history of racism that brought this picture into being and continue to sustain it without very much critical analysis for many, many decades. Virginia and Jennifer's article discusses this process of arriving at this revised title as a carefully balanced gesture of restored memory and acknowledged forgetting, which are themes that play a major role for us throughout the curatorial process for the show. So we wanted to specifically address the non-neutrality of titles for historical artworks in the show. These are titles that are often assigned not by the artist, but in the 19th century or the 20th century by a dealer who decides to sell something, I need a title, or to refer to something, I need this title. And they can really skew our sense of what we should be looking at, right? Calling this Charles Calvert, you're going to read that cataloging information and look straight to that figure. You're already being primed to do so by the composition as well, but adding the title to it further naturalizes and enforces this unbalanced power dynamic. So With respect to this painting, we don't have a particular, research has not yielded a possible identity for the Black boy in the same way that our research on the Perry Hall pictures did, but our labels sought to nonetheless refocus attention not just on the subservience of this once known child, but on his possible experience. And I think a small but effective change that we made to our label text was to invert the order of the cataloging and the interpretation. So you might be, probably never thought about this, but you might be used to seeing the cataloging on top of the interpretation. So it's the first thing that you look to as a visitor. And with this subtle change, we hoped to direct visitors away from the cataloging as the go-to first thing that you should look at to understand a painting. So we violated another rule by allowing for longer labels for the show too. I'm sure you're like, this label is insane. It's not 100 words, but we were not okay with sticking to a 100-word label in the context of this show, and wanted really to acknowledge with that exploring marginalized histories often requires more time and more work from the curators and from the museum goers than might be considered typical. Another approach that we took to interpreting the trope of the Black page was engagement with contemporary artists. And so you'll see here, we worked with Fred Wilson in one case, a name that I'm sure many of you know. This portrait, which is also from Maryland and by the same artist as the one we were just looking at, was displayed along with an excerpt from an interview that my colleague Sade conducted with Vanessa German, whose work often explores themes of Black women's power. And in her incredibly powerful imagining, she stated, I'll just read this out loud because it's so powerful. I'm curious in this picture about the imagination of the Black woman. Where is she right now? While her body is physically present, where is her spirit? As the kind of artist I am, I want to make the lives whole of the Black people I see. There's no way I can look at any of these images and not see myself also. Another key role of the interpretation was looking to descendants for their perspectives and their experiences of artworks that were relevant to their family histories. So moving for just a moment away from formal portraiture, while I was researching this work known as the Van Bergen overmantel, painted near Albany in the early 18th century, I connected with a woman named Eleanor Meyer, who is a descendant of people enslaved by the Van Bergen family, as well as members of the Van Bergen family. And the painting really struck her in a spiritual sense. We recorded an interview with her and made it available alongside the painting, in which she described her experience of looking at the picture for the first time. Although the numerous figures of color in the composition almost all remain entirely unnamed, and certainly none can be described as a portrait, Meyer explained the highly charged and almost religious, spiritual experience of looking at the picture that nonetheless indexed the lives of her forebears. And she says, I just wanted to touch, because it's so much more difficult if you're Black to find your ancestors. And here I am, someone who might be depicted on a painting. I'm seeing something solid. It was a very emotional time for me to see that, the woman who may have been brought over here under terrible circumstances, and I believe she's referring here to the woman seated here, who has been speculatively identified as a woman named Angalu, who was gifted as a marriage gift to the white householder depicted in the center of the frame. And she goes on to say, she had to live through all that so I could be here now. And now I'm finding my ancestors again. It's like they're calling to us. I've been here, come and find me, here I am, I found you. It's like all of a sudden there's a hand on your shoulder, tapping on your shoulder, saying, here I am. So a really incredible response, I think, to a picture that for a lot of people is, has, I think, historically been inaccessible for a variety of reasons. And one, not incidentally, is that this is considered folk art, which is not usually given pride of place in many museum collections. MCHC, of course, accepted as a historical institution. But I think art historically, so many of these images have been overlooked as potential sources of inspiration and healing. Another point that was really moving about this particular picture is Eleanor Meyer's connection to a white descendant of the Van Bergen family who recently wrote a book about her ancestors, for which Eleanor wrote the afterword. The two of them together discovered that they were biologically related in spite of their different racial backgrounds. And in spite of the wrenching history of violence that I'm sure informed that fact, they came together in really, I think, a model of how we might move forward together to work on projects like this. So the potential power behind representations like these, even with such seemingly small and incidental figures, is evoked with a similarly haunting kind of force for me in this portrait of a portrait of a white Bostonian at the center. But if you look very closely, you will see also a black figure, perhaps a boy of anywhere between 10 and 15, behind the shoulder of the wealthy white merchant who's depicted here. This portrait is especially interesting not only as one of the only surviving such works made for a New Englander. There are two before the Revolution. This is one of them, and I'll show you the other one in a moment. But this is also just such a strange composition. This is not following this convention that we've unfortunately become accustomed to, right? This is a very unusual, idiosyncratic composition, which to me really reaffirms the likelihood that this boy, however small, references a once living member of this household, or at least someone who is present for this portrait, because no 17th century portraitist would have made such an idiosyncratic decision without it being dictated to him by his patron, lest the portrait go rejected, which was not uncommon at the time. So with this in mind, the importance of this picture becomes even greater. We might even be looking at the earliest depiction of a black New Englander here with this image, which I should say was made in London, but for a second generation Bostonian and sent to him. We have the letter documenting the work's transit across the Atlantic to be hung in his home in Boston. Something else that really upends our expectations in looking at this picture is the fact that the black figure is standing behind a stack of account books. This is unusual. This is not, again, what we're usually seeing in this kind of art historical inclusion of a black figure into a white portrait. So this could be, perhaps speculatively, again, a member of the sitter's household entourage who was being trained as a clerk. Samuel Shrimpton was a merchant. This was his stock and trade to have this stack of account books. It was not unusual, actually, for enslaved New Englanders to be literate, especially if you are working in a household that requires literacy in order to make you more useful to the enslaver. We have actually a surviving account book that was kept by a black man named Caesar Linden, enslaved in Newport, Rhode Island, which documents all kinds of transactions that he kept track of for the family that enslaved him, but also activities that he was organizing for his own community, for his friends in the black community. And if you're curious, his work, Caesar Linden's work, survives at the Rhode Island Historical Society. But in our exhibition interpretation for this work, we do propose some possible identities for the figure, one of which was inspired by the work of historian Wendy Warren, who wrote a wonderful book called New England Bound, which is about histories of slavery in 17th century Boston and its environs. So she proposes, could this boy be Dick, whose name appears more than once in the family papers of the white sitter, as well as in Boston court records? Could it also be a man named Robin, for whom a coat was made by Shrimpton's tailor at the end of the 1600s? Was he one of the 14 unnamed black people documented as human property in the 1713 will of Shrimpton's widow? So we have some substantial family papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society which give us a glimpse of some of these possibilities, even if they don't provide a clear answer. And we encouraged visitors to engage in this line of questioning as part of the recuperative process, and to look on this image as an opportunity to engage with this kind of reimagining, visualized, of the possibility of the experience of this Black boy. An extraordinary family portrait from early 18th century Rhode Island similarly prompts engagement with Black histories in a really unusual region in New England's history of slavery. So Rhode Island had, by percentage of the population, New England's largest proportion of Black residents for much of the 18th century, with Newport, which was a key port in the slave trade, but also its surrounding large farms in an area known as the Narragansett country. These areas served as strongholds for the institution of slavery, in spite of the colony's Quaker origins. And here we found large farms worked by groups of enslaved laborers, whereas in most of New England, people who were enslaved, we were talking about percentages of perhaps 1, 2, or 3% of a rural population, perhaps 1 or 2 enslaved people in a household. Very isolating experience. In the Narragansett region, which has even been compared to the southern plantation economy, it's still very different. We're maybe talking about 24 people laboring on a farm in Rhode Island. So this is a very different scale, and nonetheless, in a household like this, the wealthy household of John Potter, there may have been as many as 24 people enslaved, and they were charged with taking care of the family farm, but also, as suggested in this picture, with seeing to the family's daily domestic needs and to cultivating, creating a sense of gentility that especially provincial, wealthy, white New Englanders were seeking to construct for themselves as a way of making themselves appear cosmopolitan and elevating their sense of social identity. So in this community, the ratio of Black to white inhabitants was astonishingly high for New England. And we're really looking at the 1730 town of South Kingstown, where this picture was made, was inhabited by almost 1,000 white people and 333 people of African descent. So within this context, which is very different from anywhere else in New England, the family's decision to portray themselves as slaveholders is very notable, because, as I mentioned, this is just one of 2 works that even reference the trope of the Black page known in pre-revolutionary New England. So this composition is really underlining power over enslaved laborers as essential to the structure, not only of the Potter's daily life, but of their self-image. And they desire to project that self-image in terms of enslavement in the very center of their home. This is an overmantel painting, which means that it was placed atop the hearth, probably because it is, in fact, an incredibly ambitious picture. Even though it looks like maybe the artist didn't have quite the skill to achieve their full ambition, it is still a very ambitious picture. It would have probably been hung in the family's parlor, which was the social center of the home. This is who the Potters want to be. This is how they want to be seen for the outside world. So the Black youth here is employed, of course, in the service in the genteel ritual of taking tea, which was a particular marker of gentility at this time, which is also an interesting intersection with cosmopolitan tradition and with the larger triangle trade. We have on view, as well as tea, which was the product of global luxury trade. Mahogany is the surface of the mahogany tea table, which would have been harvested by enslaved laborers in the West Indies. We have silver, we have sugar. These are all products of the luxury trade, and the child being placed on the same level as these objects, as Fred Wilson affirms in his own interview for the show, the child is being placed on the same level compared visually with these material objects of luxury. Although we have no specific records of who the Potters were enslaving at this time that the painting was made, the picture nonetheless prompts us to envision what life may have been like for a boy within this household. So because South Kingstown was home to a larger number of Black people, there was, I think, likely more of a sense of community there for African American people, in contrast to so much of rural New England, as I was mentioning. So there could have been more of a sense of family and community for this child. We also know that in this particular village, Black members of the community were deeply engaged in religious life. They regularly attended church services. They also participated in an annual festivity known as Black Election Day. I'm really curious, has anyone here heard of Black Election Day in New England in the 18th century? Okay, this is a really interesting but very little known festivity that took place throughout New England, in which a symbolic Black governor was elected as a community leader, often someone enslaved within a prominent white family. So we have very complex relationships developing in this context between Black Rhode Islanders and the wealthy white enslaving class, which comprised a deeply fraught combination of intimacy that was enforced and violence. And this continued into the 19th century. So just a quick aside here that I'm working on some current research in collaboration with the director of the South County History Center in South Kingstown, Rhode Island, to explore some of the continuing interracial dynamics in the area through the lens of 19th century pictures of Black community members by local white artists. And if you're familiar with Rhode Island history at all, you may recognize the name Hazard, which was the name included in both of these two unrelated Black members of the community, but which was the name of one of the largest slaveholding families in Rhode Island at the time who intermarried with the Potters. So interesting to see, even just in the form of a name, the legacy of those relationships carrying forward into the 19th century, almost into the 20th. But so to close out our discussion of the 18th century, I want to share a remarkable example, a singular example of a pair of portraits of white slaveholders depicted by a man whom they themselves enslaved. This is a very little known story, but is just starting to get better known. The story of Prince Dima, who was an enslaved portraitist living in Massachusetts around the time of the Revolution. Christian and Henry Barnes also enslaved Prince Dima's mother, Daphne. And like the enslaved poet Phyllis Wheatley, Dima's creativity was touted by his enslavers, who sponsored his artistic development financially. They sent him to London for training. They seek sitters out for him by advertising in local Boston newspapers. So they really are taking up this idea of Black creativity as a kind of pet project, an agenda for them to advance for their own gain. They also, it would seem, engaged Dima in portraying the two of them, although it's interesting to note these two depictions are quite different. One seems to be a copy after a work by John Singleton Copley, that is the work by Christian Barnes, whereas the depiction of Henry Barnes seems to perhaps be more sympathetic and is an original composition that Dima himself composed. But again, in the same vein as the story of Joshua Johnson, this really raises some very fraught questions about Dima's experience painting the very people who held him in bondage in this case. Portraiture had enormous symbolic power in the 18th century. These were not just like, snapshots. These were objects that carried metaphorical force. And one of the most fascinating elements of these two pictures is the still visible damage sustained here at the center. Ooh, my computer doesn't really want to do that, but you can see what I'm pointing at. In the same place in the portrait of Henry Barnes, too, we see a hole. It's a little bit more difficult to see. But this is evidence of an iconoclastic attack that is believed to have taken place during the violent fury of the revolutionary movement, this moment of rupture which upended social conventions and actually probably was the inciting incident that allowed Prince Dima to self-emancipate. The Barneses were loyalists. They fled the scene. Dima and many others in his situation were able to take advantage of this moment to in fact, make new lives for themselves, although, of course, the social circumstances would have made it very difficult for them to find a viable means of living. And in the case of Dima, he sought to address this by joining the Patriot cause. And sadly, we believe he died at Valley Forge, perhaps of sickness, although he extraordinarily left behind a will and bequeathed all of his worldly goods to his mother, Daphne. So we know quite a lot about this man's history. And the survival of these portraits is really an extraordinary opportunity to engage materially and visually with Dima's remarkable story. If you'd like to read more about him, Jennifer Van Horn has a chapter on him in her book, Portraits of Resistance, and Zara Anna Shanslin, who's another University of Delaware colleague, I think has a forthcoming book on this topic, but I haven't seen it yet. So moving into the 19th century, Black Northerners at this time begin to move out of the margins of compositions and into the center of the frame, as I've said. So these were developments that were due in part to social change brought about by emancipation, which was gradual. There's a mythology that, slavery in Massachusetts ends in 1783, and slavery in Connecticut was not officially outlawed until 1848. So that's a big outlier in New England, but nonetheless, this was a practice that gradually came to end over a course of many decades. So there's a lot of very slow social change happening, but some of this allows certain Black middle-class families to develop a degree of prosperity, and we're seeing that here in this extraordinary example of two portraits by husband and wife by William Matthew Pryor, who was a white artist based in Boston. William and Nancy Lawson were a prominent Black couple. William Lawson was a clothing dealer, which was a fairly among the limited professions that one could choose as a Black Bostonian. Being a clothing dealer, being a barber, these were prominent professions for Black men. So they were able to set aside enough discretionary income to purchase two really extraordinary commissions. I mean, these are just, I think these are the masterpieces of William Matthew Pryor's oeuvre, in my opinion. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but they are, especially the portrait of Nancy Lawson, lavish, full of detail. Pryor famously offered portraits at different price points. So if you wanted a simple, cheap and cheerful portrait of your baby, you could have one for, I think, $1. If you wanted something like this was a $5, each one of these was a $5 portrait. And so the expression of pride that is being put forth here really can't be underestimated. But I think it's really important to point out these are still very much outliers, even among wealthy, middle-class members of the Black community who had the means to commission portraits. This is still something that really required an alignment of the stars. We know that Pryor, amid a society that was rife with racism, yes, even in the abolitionist North, even in Boston, William Matthew Pryor was unusual as a white artist who was known to depict several sitters of African descent, including members of the Copeland family. And Mr. Copeland and Mr. Lawson were neighbors in their business. So I'm sure that they knew each other. They also knew Pryor themselves through religious connections. And so all of these connections in the community were, I would suggest, really important in creating a level of comfort for the Lawsons in commissioning a portrait from a white artist. This would have required hours of sitting. Do you want to sit for hours in front of someone whose racial animus you are not comfortable with, to be looked at, to be in the same space, and also even just to be seeking a representation of self that is making use of such a white-coded medium historically, such a racist medium as we've been looking at with these other images. I really think it was not just financial limitations for many Black families, but these fraught dynamics, as well as the long history of portraiture as a white medium that led to the paucity of Black portraiture, because there are very few surviving images like this. It also we pointed out to visitors that it's very important to consider when thinking about why these portraits of the Lawsons are so rare, we have to look also at the absence of Black sitters in the oeuvre of so many prolific white artists who at this time, especially in the genre of what we might call folk portraiture, they were democratizing portraiture in the 19th century as a format that had previously really only been reserved for an elite white people. This was now something that a local rural family with a little bit of extra income could afford. So someone like Emelie Phillips, I don't know if this name will be familiar to you, but he was an iconic vernacular artist who produced hundreds of likenesses of rural New Englanders and New Yorkers in the early mid-19th century. He is not known to have painted a single Black sitter, and it's not because there were no Black community members in his pretty vast region where he was moving around painting lots of different folks. It's not because there were no interested Black folks who had the means to commission a portrait. I think there was also a lack of comfort with the medium. Unfortunately, at the same moment, we also have a robust visual development during this time period in terms of the racist visual vocabulary of caricature that is gaining traction at this time. The language of racism visually takes time to develop. Even the language of racism culturally is not fully crystallized in the 18th century among New Englanders. This is something that develops especially as emancipation becomes more common and the white community begins to feel threatened, in particular the white working class begins to feel threatened by the potential for Black free men to take their jobs, to move into their neighborhoods. So in response to that sense of threat, we see images like this start to emerge, which actually represents a very courageous event that took place annually, a celebration in Boston, the streets of Boston, of the abolition of the slave trade, in which members of the local African society took part. But what we are also seeing, if you look closely at this image, is this development of tropes of Black physiognomy, racist exaggeration of facial features, and also simply a mockery of a sense of Black pride and dignity, which is further borne out in this series of racist broadsides with a mockery of Black vernacular English. This is entitled "The Grand Abolition of Slavery," as a mocking point of vernacular English. Another theme in Black representation at this time is the development of pictures like this one, which unfortunately we could not borrow for the show, but which speaks to another trend. This is a woman from Connecticut named Nancy Toney, who's sometimes referred to as apocryphally as the last slave in Connecticut, but she was enslaved into the 1840s. She's depicted here, of course, not in the mode of formal portraiture, but in a domestic setting, so in a kind of genre painting. She's surrounded by the tools of her labor. We know that she was painted by an artist who was a member of the white household that had enslaved her, that continued to enslave her formally until, I believe, until her death. So this picture seems to be intended as a sign of affection towards Toney as a hardworking member of this white household, but it is conjuring new pictorial tropes of Black worthiness as attendant on a role within a white household. So again, it's defining Black value in terms of what this woman could offer the white household in which she labored, rather than on an independent individual identity, as we see in formal portraiture compositions. Even certain Black portraits, like this one, are more complex in terms of their power dynamics than we might immediately understand. This representation appears to capture something of the sitter's sparkling personality. This is a man named Abraham Hansen. He was a barber working in Maine in the early 19th century. But what we know about the origins of this picture really gives us a different understanding of it. and really tells a story about how Black portraiture still remains subject to a white agenda in many cases. Reportedly, and this is part of a memoir written by the artist's niece, Hardy did not make this portrait for Hansen, the sitter, but rather to advertise his own skill at capturing a skin tone that was unfamiliar to him. So this was a work that he would have hung alongside other works that sort of signaled his virtuosity in his studio to show off and to entice sitters, rather than to hang in Abraham Hansen's home in the same way that portraiture had typically done to signify the identity of a white sitter. Perhaps because of challenges like this, some Black Northerners, many Black Northerners, looked to photography and even looked to photography when they had the means to commission a portrait. I believe this was the case for this man, Agrippa Hull, who was a Revolutionary War veteran living in Western Massachusetts. Because of its striking resemblance to this daguerreotype, it seems that Hull did not make, he didn't sit for this likeness. This likeness was made after his daguerreotype. For all we know, it was actually made after Agrippa Hull had died. That would have been, in fact, a natural moment to create a portrait of this man who was considered he was sort of a local celebrity. He had this storied history of being a Revolutionary War veteran. He was a local landowner of some means. But rather than going to the portraitist studio, when he seeks a likeness for whatever reason, he goes to the photographer's studio. And this is very much what we see with many African Americans of this time. And to close on a note of uplift, I'll share some of the wonderful photographs that we included in the exhibition. We borrowed a collection of over 50 Black portraits made from the mid-19th century at the dawn of photography into the late 19th century. I think one of the reasons that Black Americans did respond so enthusiastically to the advent of photography has to do with the words of Frederick Douglass, who famously believed that no white painter could capture a Black subject without bias, but famously used photography to promote his own political causes and to promote his talks and his works. In this quotation here, we also see his belief in photography as a democratic medium. At the time, this would have been understood as especially in comparison to painted portrait, as a neutral medium that could capture someone's likeness without bias. So we see him exhorting that the humbled servant girl may now possess a more perfect likeness of herself. And this is really borne out in examples from the show that showcase such a wonderful range of representations and show so much, I think, joy in the freedom associated with being able to make one's own choices about how to present oneself to the world. And here's we showed these works both on a digital screen, so in a kind of larger than life presentation as you're seeing here, but also in a case we had the physical and material remnants of this expression of self-fashioning and pride in a Black identity that was developing at this time. So I want to make sure that we have time for some questions, so I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Catherine to coordinate the Q&A.
So how did you ensure in your practice and your planning how you weren't propagating and perpetuating white supremacy and colonialism?
Yes, that's such an important question to think about, and it was one that we were thinking about constantly. I think one of the really important aspects of the planning process was recognizing from the beginning that this needed to be very much a collaborative process. And the typical curatorial models of sort of the curator as the voice of authority, we wanted the interpretation to be full of questions. we wanted to have multiple different perspectives expressed, and also to really ensure that we were continually expressing that we're not presenting answers. We're presenting material to be considered. And I think one way that we infused the project with multiple perspectives was through the book project, which was not a traditional catalog with an entry, written by me and my colleagues, but it was an anthology of different scholarly perspectives, and we chose scholars and writers from across different disciplines. I also would say that I think the show's venue at the American Folk Art Museum was really important. Not to tout my own museum as the solution to colonialism in museums, but it is an institution that did not develop in the late 19th century. It is not kind of mired in quite the same degree of structural colonial problems that we see at other institutions, where even just, I couldn't do this show because you're not allowed to curate like more than one different medium. It's like you're a paintings curator, you're a textiles curator, these categories are so entrenched in ideas from the 18th and 19th century. And so the Folk Art Museum I look at it as a platform to explore, even beyond this show, but just in general, I think about our museum as a home for centering marginalized stories. Everything about the museum's mission is about looking outside the academic structures of the fine art world and acknowledging that creativity belongs to everyone. And so I think that is something that really infused our approach. Yes, I also wanted from the very beginning, although I saw that I was in a position to bring this project to fruition, that I wanted to approach my power in that regard as an opportunity to engage other curators in the process. And so I sought out and invited 2 other African-American women curators to join me, one of whom has been my friend for 25 years, and it was just such a blessing to be able to work with them. Another of whom joined the museum for a 2-year fellowship and is now going on to her own platform at the Columbia Museum of Art in Columbia, South Carolina. So it was an opportunity for all 3 of us that I thought was really interesting because, and I didn't really intend, I don't think we really knew this was happening, but all 3 of us, it was the first time that we had curated a major loan show. RL, not an art historian, first of all. Sade, still working on her PhD. I had left my commercial job and was just coming out of graduate school. So I think something that helped was that we were all a little bit coming at it from well, I don't know, why do we usually do this? Do we have to do it the way that people usually do it? That really helped, I think, just creatively. And we developed a really wonderful friendship between the 3 of us. So there was a lot of trust and warmth, and we were just able to pursue a lot of different potential ideas throughout the process.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have you investigated, or would you expect to find similar depictions if you went through the South?
Oh, well. Yes, read Jennifer Van Horn's book, Portraits of Resistance, because she takes an even more expansive view and looks at some very interesting questions about Black presence and absence in the South. There's an amazing chapter about iconoclasm against portraits. So continuing in the thread of the Prince Dima story, but in the aftermath of the Civil War. And so there are, I believe, more Black representations to be found in the South. As I mentioned, even the trope of the Black page is more common in Maryland and Virginia than it is anywhere north of there. So yes, there are examples of similar portraiture, and also the kind of trope of including small staffage figures in landscapes is very much a long-standing art historical tradition that's discussed in a really interesting book by in terms of the Southern plantation landscape called Planter's Prospect. Is that what it's called? By John Michael Vlach, which was really an inspiration to the project as well. So I'd recommend looking at both of those. Yeah.
When you're dealing with interpreting absence in art or material culture, I was really impressed or pleased by the use of like contemporary artists or poetry to sort of fill in the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if there's any other interpretive strategies that you used when maybe a Black figure wasn't represented, but you knew there was a story there.
Yes. Well, I left this out of my talk tonight because I had talked about this at Homewood and I didn't want to cover too much of the same ground, but one of my favorite works on the show, which sadly I don't have in a slide, but is a landscape from Connecticut from the late 18th century, which has no people in it at all. And it's long been interpreted only in terms of the white landowning family that, like, you know, sponsored the whole town, and they built the house that's on display. And but also in the picture is a general store, which was frequented by everyone, including numerous Black residents of the town, both enslaved and free. And in pursuing research on that picture, I was able to connect with a number of descendants who, oh God, I really wish I had this slide, but one of the descendants had this amazing interview where she talks about when she first looked at the picture, she thought, oh, it looks very sterile. I would not envision that if there were people in it, that there would be Black people in this picture. But then, you know, she goes on to say that how when she looked at it further and talked with us about the documentary evidence that her ancestors, her Black ancestors, some of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, were frequenting that store, and we know what they were purchasing from that store, these small luxuries that they afforded themselves, the necessities of their daily life, their relationships to the local land, which they were part of building the local landscape. We know they were exchanging their services as agricultural laborers, as municipal workers, creating roads in exchange for chocolate and pieces of ribbon and daily necessities. So that really brings to life how much is unseen in a landscape like that. That's a very classical landscape. I mean, if you don't read the interpretation, you don't get that, obviously. So people have to read the labels, but which sometimes is hard. But we tried to activate that by using the voices as well of the descendants whom we interviewed and who spoke so powerfully to their own experience of looking at these images differently. Thank you so much.